Alright, in the previous tutorial we worked on our inventory check for open slot exterior event code, so that when we ran this variable here, or we set it to 1, it checked for our topmost open slot and gave that value to this variable check for open slot. Open slot. Now let's come to our Kingdom Room collisions code here. And this is where we were hard coding our items to go into Bob's inventory, right? And for right now, I'm actually going to do the unthinkable here for a second. I'm going to delete this room 2 code because I just want to work on this room 1, and then I can always just copy it and change a couple of values here and there. But this actually needs to be changed somewhat significantly for our new bit of code, our new bit of information. Now the first thing I see we're going to need to do already is we don't have this set up correctly as it is. I'm looking at this now, and the way it's working is as soon as Bob touches the chest, his inventory is full, and the item is changed even before we hit the space key. Now, we don't want that, right? So let's move this down underneath the dialog here. All right, and we also want to input our item count, even though we're not really using it right now. We want to do that as well, so we'll change that too. All right, let's think about how we're going to enter this room, right? So if these conditions are true, if the current room is equal to 1, that's fine. If the chest is full, that's still fine, okay? But we have a new bit of information now. If all of our inventory is full, right? If the inventory slot is full, all of them, then open slot variable, the value of that is going to be 0. And that means there's no room for Bob's inventory or for Bob's new item. So we have to indicate both for when we can accept an item and when we can't because it's full. And then we can leave this down here too for when there's just simply nothing else left in the chest. So let's copy this entire 2 pieces of code. Let's go ahead and just paste it so that we have 2 identical pieces of code here, but they're going to function in very different ways. First way we're going to make this part here function is if we actually have room. And we're going to test that by changing our condition here, or adding a condition of our global variable, open slot. And let's think about this. What sign of test do we need here? If there's an open slot, it just means that it's greater than 0, right? Or even different than 0. We could have used that too, right? So if open slot is greater than 0, it means there's a slot open, which means we can accept an item here. So we've got this true, and if this is true, and then if we hit the space key and we've got the open slot, we'll add it here. Now what happens if there is no open slot? Let's copy this. Let's paste this down here, right? And let's say slot is equal to 0, open slot is equal to 0. Our dialog is going to be something along the lines of, I don't have room for this item. Now we're not going to fill anything, so we can get rid of that. And we're not going to change whether the chest is full or not. We're just going to do nothing with it. All right. let's keep going here. Let's figure out. This can actually stay the same. There's nothing else left. That's fine. This is the one that we need to work a little bit more on here, is if we have an open slot. Well, how do we know if we have an open slot? So I was working on this before, and I'll talk with you now too. I try to work on these prior to videoing them, which is why sometimes you'll see that I missed something here to get rid of. We need to actually check to see if there's an open slot first, right, before we can run this code. So the easiest way to do that is to run the code as soon as Bob is in collision with the chest. Not when we hit the space key, but as soon as he's in collision. And how do we run a check for open slot? We change this variable here to 1. So let's do that. Let's run a check here, global variable. Okay, now as soon as Bob is in collision with the chest, it'll run this code, it'll find out if there's an open slot available and assign it a value, and then it'll come back down here and run this code. But we've still got this hard-coded here, right, so that it goes automatically in Bob's first slot. We don't want that. We want it to go into the next available open slot. So how are we going to do this? We need to use an expression here, okay? And we've done this in the past. And I'm going to try to explain this a little bit better today because it is important that you understand how these are used. I think the easiest way to think about these expressions is values versus string, right? So in GDevelop, a value basically equals a number of some sort, right? And a string equals a text, right? Lettering, things like that. When you see global variable, it's thinking in terms of a value, right? A number. And when you see global variable string, it's thinking in terms of text. So, how do we use a variable in place of a value or a string that we need? We can do this. We can start our global variable here by saying Bob inventory, right? And then we can fill in the part we don't know with this expression here. We start with an open bracket to indicate we're going to input some kind of variable here, right? Then we need to tell the software how to treat this variable. Do we want to treat it as a value here? Or do we want to treat it as if it's a string here, to use it as text? And the answer is, you might think you'd want to use it as a value. We want the value of this. But in reality, we want to treat this as a string, as one string that looks just like this. So we put global variable string, and then parenthesis, we put in imanager.openSlot because that's what's holding our value there. I know it's a little confusing, but think of it as the software wants to treat this as a string. It's still taking the value of this, but it wants to treat this as a string, as a text, right? So that the software essentially sees this. So open slot, close parenthesis, close the bracket, and then the item ID. So let's copy this. Let's paste it in here. Oh, that doesn't work. Oh, it almost worked. It did work. Okay, there we go. There was just a little bit of a delay. I'm going to change this to isFilled, and then we'll copy and paste the rest. IsFilled equals 1, right? Now I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to copy and paste this 2 more times. Paste and paste. Because I also want to change the item ID, right? And for right now, we still have our item ID for this chest is just 1. It's just a sword in here, and that's totally fine. But I also want to change the item count here as well, even though we're not doing much with item counts, just to be consistent here. All right, Let's see how we did here. Let's just try to get the item into the slot here. So let me bring up the project manager, and let me bring up the main room here so we can run a preview from it. Let's see how we did. Okay, that's room 1. Let's check our inventory. So now it should return that the next open slot is 4. Let's see how we did. Hey, I found a sword. All right, here's the big moment. There it is. Now what happens if we go back? Good, that's exactly what we wanted to happen. There's nothing else in there. What happens if the inventory is full, however? Let's go ahead and go to Project Manager, and let's go to our global variables Bob inventory, and let's give him another item here. This field equals 1, 1, 1, that's fine. Okay, and now I want to copy and paste room 1 of our Kingdom Room Collisions. Let's copy and paste this and paste it in here. And let's change this for room 2 now. So current room is now 2. Rooms.2. That's still fine. This should be, hey, I found a health potion. Open slot, that stays the same. This needs to be changed to 2, right? Because we're dealing with the chest in room 2. Current room equals 2. Okay, open slot, that stays the same. That stays the same. All right. All right, let's see how we do when we go into both rooms here. Let's run our preview from main. Let's go get our sword first. Okay, so now we've got 4 full slots. Okay, good. Now we've got 5 full slots. The inventory is open. What happens when we go to try to get our health potion here? All right. Okay, that's great. It's exactly what we wanted to happen. Okay, and we're going to start working on choosing and selecting and unselecting items and deleting them as well, so we can make room for this health potion.